Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing fantastically. Thank you for joining us tonight for the ninth in our series of exclusive online talks for the Kent Archaeological Society. That is 9 months that we've been doing these now. Jacob, that's a long time. Actual babies have been made in that time. Not by us, I should add, but yeah, it's we've been doing this a bit, and it's going fantastically. So thank you all for joining us again. It's great to see you all. Things have been very busy at the Society, so I hope you've all been keeping up on our various activities. Check out the website for details on all that. As for tonight, as always, we hope to avoid any technical issues, but bear with us if there are any problems. Jacob will expertly guide us through these, I have no doubt. So, if you're not a member of the Society and you'd like to, please do think about joining us. It works out about £3.30 a month, and you receive a copy of our journal, Archaeologia Cantiana, with the most current historical and archaeological research in the county. You'll also receive our biannual magazine, regular newsletters, exclusive access to our collections, conferences and selected events, opportunities to get involved in excavations and research projects, and you allow us to keep on putting on talks like this. So please do have a think about if you would like to become a member, and check out the website for more details on that. Housekeeping, it's the usual. The talk will last around an hour, after which time we'll have time for questions, if you have any. So please keep yourself on mute with your cameras off for the duration of the talk so that we can hear our speaker clearly. During the Q&A, you can either use the raise a hand feature and we'll unmute you, or if you prefer, you can type your questions into the Q&A box, into the chat box, and I will ask those to Janys for you. I hope it goes without saying, but please be courteous and polite to our speaker and to each other. We'll be recording the session, and it may be posted to our video channels in the future, but no personal data will be shared. And if you ask a question but would prefer it not to be published, just send us an email saying so, and we'll make sure that it was not included. So, on to our speaker. I hope I've got this right. Janys is, and I know this bit's right, Janys is an incredible author, writing historical women's fiction. She's a retired civil servant working as a VIT liaison officer at the Department of Communities and an office manager at the Department for Communities and Local Government. She studied literature at the Open University. After retirement, she had more time to work on writing. She was part of a project to research women's lives during World War I on the Isle of Sheppey, and read all the local newspapers from 1914 to 1919 and believed that there were tales to be told. Since then, she's published 2 novels, I think, which are part of a series, Dockyard Teachers, and are set during World War I in the naval dockyard town of Sheerness. Her novel Female Remedies was published in 2024. Janys is married to Jeremy. She has 2 dogs and a cat, and volunteers as treasurer for the Sheppey Little Theatre. She's secretary to the Sheppey Promenade, who run the Rose Street Cottage of Curiosities and the annual Sheppey Promenade Festival. And she was longlisted for Poet of the Year at the Canterbury Festival for 2022. Her hobbies are aerobics, painting, writing, and visiting museums and galleries, which we thoroughly encourage of all of you. We're delighted to have us here with us today to discuss Sheppey Munitionesses, women in Sheerness Dockyard in World War I. So, Janys, it is over to you.
Oh, thank you, Craig. Hopefully I don't waffle too much, because I'm used to doing this live, and so I get a little bit more sort of reaction from the audience as I'm going along. So I won't know if you're laughing at my jokes or not now. So as Craig said, so I was part of a project that we did from Sheppey Promenade in the Rose Street Cottage of Curiosities. Several local women did various aspects of women's work. My friend Rosemary did the women working in the RAF station in Eastchurch. Jo did Women's Land Army, which started in World War I, not in World War II, as most people think. And I looked at the women in the dockyard, and we had access to school logbooks from the Maidstone Archive, local history Facebook pages, local papers and the National Archives and various other things that we came across. So I started looking at women in the dockyard because obviously that was one of the biggest employers on the island at the time. And initially in World War II.
Janys, I'm so sorry. You haven't shared screen yet. I don't know if you
Oh, sorry.
to do it. Sorry.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
You wanted to look at. I told you I'd be rubbish at this, didn't I?
No. It's absolutely fine. It happens all the time. You get into it, and
Right, here we go.
there we
Is
go.
that okay?
Perfect. Thank you. Yep. We can see it all fine. Thank you. Carry on.
Right, so this is the first slide anyway. So during World War II, men who worked in the dockyard were in what was called a reserve occupation, so they weren't called up. But during World War One, there wasn't that provision. When the 1916 Military Service Act was introduced, bringing in conscription for the First World War, men were called up, whatever their employment was. And so men were volunteering from the dockyard, which of course is not really what you want. You don't want the men that are repairing your naval ships going off to war. You want people to repair your naval ships. However, because there was such a demand for men to be at the front, they did a project, what they called dilution. And dilution was like a time and motion study where they looked at the roles that men did and saw what parts of those roles could be done by women, unskilled or able to learn some of that work without a 7-year apprenticeship to start with. So that's when the dockyard first started taking women in, was in 1917. And one of the local papers had a report about what was called Girls at the Nor, and this was really good for information of what kind of roles the women were doing. This slide says they're in the electrical department there, but the article said that the women were doing things like making racers for torpedoes, which is the fins that go on the back of the torpedoes. They were repairing propellers in the foundry. They were making the torpedo tubes. They were boiler makers, and the boiler makers earned higher wages. They worked in the galvanizing shop and they worked in the sawmills. One of the other details it tells us is that they were wearing brown uniforms, which from the pictures you'd probably think that they were going to be blue because blue is the colour of the Navy, but they were wearing brown overalls, and these overalls would have also been made in the dockyard in what is called the colour loft, and I'll come back to the colour loft in a little while. So one of the things that the author of this article, Girls at the Nor, said was that all the girls were very cheery, especially when some good-looking, blue-eyed naval officer came along and gave them the momentary glad eye. Now, if you don't know what a glad eye is, this is the glad eye. And as you can see, we've got a German girl on one side and the British girl on the other. And so this was quite a common thing where what was called sweetheart cards were made with girls in military uniforms. That's the glad eye. Now then, you may all have seen the film Made in Dagenham, which was about the Ford workers, the women Ford workers getting equal pay in the 1960s and being the first women to get equal pay. However, back in April 1917, the women working in the dockyards achieved equal pay. And this was achieved by the National Federation of Women Workers, who were headed by a lady called Mary MacArthur, and the Workers' Union, whose chief women organiser was a lady called Julia Varley. And they attempted to ensure that the dockyard workers were not left out of pay advances awarded by the munition workers under the Ministry of Munitions. And a lady called Miss Risborough, who is a lady from Gillingham, was one of the deputation that went to London to argue the case for equal pay for the women workers in the dockyards. Now, they were actually granted equal pay. However, it wasn't quite as clear cut as we would like to think, and they had to be doing work which was exactly the same as the men did. And this was a sort of get out of jail free card for the employer, in that they would argue that the women weren't doing exactly the same. And it would be things like the fact that men could obviously carry heavier weights than women. And they would argue, well, that woman's only carrying 5 pounds, whereas the man is carrying 10 pounds. So she's not doing the same work. And by those methods, they kept the pay slightly below what the men earned. However, having said that, this was a national pay award, so it applied not only to Sheerness and Chatham dockyards, but it also applied to Portsmouth and Plymouth and Pembroke and all the other dockyards around the country. The women were paid on paper the same as the men, so that was quite a big achievement. One of the other things that was at first was that women started working as clerical officers. And this picture is of the records for clerical officers from the National Archive. And there are some women working before the war broke out. However, they weren't what was called established civil servants. And the difference between being a non-established civil servant is the right to a pension. So once those women were taken on as established civil servants, it gave them the full benefit of all the rights as civil servants that the men enjoyed. Now then, we also know that they were being paid between 17 to 25 shillings per week. And I will keep telling you how much people earned, because I think obviously it's quite interesting to know what they earned when you compare that to other workers at the time. For instance, a housemaid might only be earning 10 shillings, but she would get all her board and lodgings paid for as well. When they first started taking on the clerical officers, there was an article in the local paper which said that the management couldn't decide how to decide which women should be employed as clerical officers. And they had quite a number of women applying, so they needed some kind of mechanism. And so what they decided to do was to set them what was called the dockyard exam. Now, the dockyard exam was set every year, and all the naval dockyard towns around the country, all the schooling for the boys was geared up to take the dockyard exam. And my brother-in-law took the dockyard exam in the 1970s in Portsmouth. And what happened was that they would take the dockyard exam, and according to where they were placed in the results, would determine which roles they were offered as apprenticeships in the dockyard. So those with the highest scores would be given the jobs that could lead to management, such as, you know, they might start off as messenger boys, but it would lead to management positions. Whereas the lowest scored boys would get offered jobs as labourers. However, it would be a job for life. And so it was much sought after. And the whole of the schooling for boys was geared up towards taking the dockyard exam. Meanwhile, the girls' schooling, and we got this from the school logbooks from the Maidstone Archive, show that the girls' curriculum was things like needleworking, cooking, gardening, and knitting. So their ability to take this dockyard exam was not as good as the boys was, because they just simply didn't have the tools necessary to take the exam. So 60 women took the dockyard exam and only 6 passed. And I think it's amazing that 6 passed when you consider that none of them would have had the kind of schooling that the boys have been having since they were small. However, it was after that, they obviously looked at different ways of determining which women should get the employment. And we've also got a thing here for a lady called Sarah Jane Penny, and she's shown as being a female worker in the dockyard. This is pensions, but what we don't know is what she actually did. However, it does tell us that her earnings were not to exceed 18 shillings a week. So her earnings were capped. So when we're talking about what people's earnings were, it's, you know, it's quite interesting that she wasn't permitted to earn more than 18 shillings. Now, on May the 25th, 1918, King George V came to visit the dockyards. Now, this photograph is from Chatham Dockyard and it's on the Chatham Dockyard website. But before he arrived in Chatham, he came to Sheerness first. So his day to visit the dockyards was visiting Sheerness in the morning, and then he went on to Chatham in the afternoon. So the reception that he got would have been very similar. He reviewed the troops, he reviewed the garrison, and he met the women. Now, the local paper would tell us that he meets the women in the colour loft under a lady called Mrs. Evan, and it reports that the colour loft, the workers were the widows of the men who died at the front, and this was an actual tradition that women worked in the colour loft who were widows of men generally before the war who'd worked in the dockyard and might have met with an accident, as quite often happened, and accidents were quite often fatal without health and safety that we have today, and the women would be offered work in order that they could become the breadwinner, because initially there were no widows' pensions, and so the colour loft was a way of helping support the women who'd lost their husbands in the service of the dockyards. Obviously, by the war, pensions were introduced. But the other people that he met Mrs. Dawson in the rigging shop. He met Mrs. Forrester and Mrs. Mayers, and they were reported as making stowing spars for lighters and wire rope and wire hawsers. He then went on to meet a Miss Hoddinott in the foundry, and Miss Hoddinott gave him a demonstration of the work that she was doing. Now, this is a peace medal, which is held in the Minster Gatehouse, and peace was actually declared July 1919, and almost every town and village across the country had some kind of celebration because the war was obviously so long and bloody, and they gave out gifts to commemorate the fact that peace had arrived at. And this is a peace medal. This is Riddham Docks. Now, Riddham Docks is not a naval dockyard. It was being built when war was declared, and it was commandeered for the war effort. And what they did in Riddham Dock was called salvage, and they repaired and got uniforms back ready to be worn again. So the uniforms would be quite often taken off of dead soldiers, and so they would be covered in blood. They would have holes in from bullet wounds, and they would clean the uniforms, repair the holes, and make them good for some new recruit to wear again. And obviously this was not very pleasant work, but the women did their best to bring luck to the men by sewing little messages into the hems, which said things like "Good luck on the Western Front." These salvage ports were all over the country, and again, there are it's recorded in Portsmouth that there was one where they repaired bell tents. So it was quite an undertaking. Now, one of the things about this picture, and I'll show you a close-up of this picture. As you can see, all the women are wearing triangular badges. Now, these triangular badges say on them "on war work," and each one on the reverse has got an individual number. However, there is no central record of whose triangular badge was given to who. So nobody knows who, if you've got one that says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you won't know if it belonged to your gran or a stranger entirely. But the badges were issued by the Ministry of Munitions, because previously they'd issued a similar badge, a blue enamel badge, to the men, and the men wore them at the time when people were giving out white feathers for men who weren't in uniform. So they were wearing badges that said "on war work." And then when the women started joining the war effort, they were given triangular badges. And you sometimes see referred to the triangular badge girls. And one of the interesting things I've found out recently for some other research I'm doing is when the Princess Irene exploded in the mouth of the Medway in 1915, one of the bodies recovered, the man was wearing his on war service badge. And I think that's quite poignant. So this is the triangular badge. And again, there's another sweetheart postcard here, which has got the triangular badge on it that some young lady has done with forget-me-nots. And then I said earlier about the men having accidents at work, but accidents at work were common for the women who were then working in the dockyard doing the men's jobs. And this is a report about Mrs. Eastwood, who broke her arm in the foundry. Now, it says at the bottom here that she had to go to St. Bart's Hospital. At the time, there was obviously no National Health Service. And what happens if you were not well, if you had sickness, you'd go to the workhouse. If you were a man and worked in the dockyard, you'd go to the Naval Hospital in Chatham. If you were a soldier, you'd go to the military hospital, which was in Sheerness. But members of the public, if they were injured, they went to St. Bart's Hospital in Rochester. And this, of course, is before motor ambulances were commonplace. And so this would have meant that people would have been taken on a hand cart to the railway station. And then from the railway station, they would have travelled up to Rochester, where they would have been retrieved at the other end and then, go on to the hospital. So if you had a serious injury, that was, a pretty traumatic journey, I would imagine. Now, this is a story about sexual harassment in the workplace. Yeah, that's me as a trade union rep saying that. So we think about sexual harassment as being a sort of modern thing that's happened, but this is a story about a young lady called Gertrude Gamblin. She was 18 years old, and she was sexually assaulted by her colleague. And it doesn't tell us what actually happened, but it goes into some detail about the conversation between her and Charles Barrows. And he sexually assaults her, and she is so distressed by it. She goes home, and her mother says to him, look, mother says to her, you've got to report this. And the police brought a case on her behalf. However, the court system was slightly different. There wasn't the Crown Prosecution Service at that time who would make a decision on whether or not a case should go forward. You had to have a hearing at a magistrate's court, and then if that hearing was successful, then you'd go forward to the Crown Court in Maidstone. But she brought her case, and unfortunately, the magistrate felt that there was no case to answer and said that no court in the land would convict this fine, young, upstanding man of Charles Barrows. And so the case was not upheld. It was an unsustained charge. Now, these are the Hyde Smiths. Now, then Rear Admiral Edmund Hyde Smith was the superintendent of the dockyard, and the house at the top there is the superintendent's house, and that's still there in Sheerness Dockyard. And somebody very wealthy has bought it because there was a movement to buy the houses that were inside the now commercial port gates. And I have been in that house, and it is palatial, let me tell you. And if you see where the steps are and the two sailors doing the gardening with the sprinkler, that's a ballroom. Those 6 windows are a ballroom there. And it was like Downton Abbey, except the Lord and Lady of the house was Admiral Hyde Smith and his wife. Now, his wife is called Frances Hyde Smith. And she was like the lady of the manor in Sheerness, and she was involved in all aspects of the community. She was the chair of numerous committees. She was the chair of a committee called the Befriending Women and Girls, which we will come back. She was the chair of the Cottage Hospital Fund, so they were trying to get enough money to build a hospital locally instead of people having to go to St Bartholomew's. She used to host garden parties, like as though, she was Queen Elizabeth II. She'd have garden parties for the great and the good of the town. And she would organise all kinds of activities. So she organised a Women's Day to celebrate the work of the women working in the dockyard and the various services that were up and running by 1918. So the RAF, the Wrens, the various services that were there. And she also had a special church service, which the Archbishop came and presided over. So she was a very, very important person. So when you're reading through the source documents, Mrs. Hyde-Smith's name appears all over the place because she wasn't employed by anybody, but she was the most important woman on the Isle of Sheppey and in the dockyard. Now these pink cards are from the Red Cross, and the Red Cross, as part of the work they did for the World War I centenary, was to digitalise all their records. So these pink cards are the original records, and you can go onto their website and search by name or search by place and find out what people did. And this tells us about a lady called Alice Cavell, and it tells us that she initially went to France as a VAD, which is a voluntary aid detachment nurse, and she went to France in October 1915, and she was invalided home in 1917 and was taken out of service. But eventually, when she recovered, she went back to work again, and she was the lady superintendent in charge of the wrens in the sickbay in Admiralty House. So when we're talking about the women working in the dockyard, you've also obviously got the wrens working there and other services as well. But she was in charge of looking after the wrens. So there was a lot more thought about women's welfare as well happening at that time. And these are the events that we know that Mrs. Hyde-Smith organised. So we've got Service for Women, conducted by Archbishop Randall Thomas Davidson. We've got various sports days, Women's Day, which was like a carnival. And as you can see, there's all the different services there, the Queen Mary and Alexander, the Wrens, the RAF, and all of these things were organised by Mrs. Hyde-Smith. At the end of the war, we suddenly see a rapid demobilisation, and this is of the international stores, and this is to show you the difference between the two sort of attitudes. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got the international stores proudly boasting that over 2,000 members of staff, they've released that amount of men to go to the front because they've been replaced by women. And then on the other side, we've got demobilisation, and it's talking about if the men come back, then just come back to the stores and you can have your job back. So women were quite quickly stood down from working, and some of it was natural wastage because obviously when their husbands came back or they got married, they might have started families, or the breadwinner was there, but other times it was just that they become redundant. And we've got a couple of incidents. So from the employment committee, which was like a committee that decided on paying the equivalent of unemployment benefit, or the dole as people used to call it then, and it says that the following unemployment payments were made, and it was £554 for women, £6 for girls. Now I don't know how old a girl was in those records, whether that was a girl of 18 or up to 21. Meanwhile, only £21 was paid out in unemployment benefit to men, which is quite a big difference when you're paying out £554 to women and only £21 for men, and £22 to ex-servicemen. So it was quite a big difference in the unemployment rates for women to men. This is a little bit about the schooling, because obviously we've talked about how the schools were all geared up to get the boys to work in the dockyard. But what is quite interesting about this picture, if you look behind the teacher on the back wall, there's all ships around the back. So this is from Marinetown School in Sheerness. And these children, they would have been the children of the dockyard workers. So when you look at the numbers of people working in the dockyard, there was about 2,000 men worked in the dockyard. And we know that when the number of men eligible to vote in 1918 was published, there was 3,294. So if there's 2,000 working in the dockyard and 3,000 men living in Sheerness, that means 2 out of every 3 men is working in the dockyard. So these children, their fathers, their uncles, their grandfathers would have all been working in the dockyard, and it would, it would have been all that they knew. But then one of the things we also see is the change in the leisure time for the women. So this is girls doing what's called Swedish drill, but they called it gymnastics. So although it doesn't show in this photograph, the board that's in front of the girl in the middle at the front, it says it's there, the gymnastics team. And one of the things is they're wearing gym slips, and we tend to think of gym slips as being a school uniform, but it was a garment they could wear which was loose and allowed them to do Swedish drill. And Swedish drill was the sort of thing where you do repetitive rhythmic movements, and perhaps with things like Indian clubs. And the gym slip allowed them the freedom of movement to do that. And so this was like one of the first times when women started to do what we'd call keep fit these days. Swimming was also on the up, and swimming was changing quite dramatically. So in the bottom right-hand picture, we've got 4 young ladies here with the Union Jack on their chests. And this is from 1912, when swimming became an Olympic sport for women. And these 4 women are the British Women's Olympic relay team, and they won the gold medal. And so their costumes are quite different to what we think of as Edwardian swimsuits. They're like bikinis, a little bit risque actually if you look at them closely, or don't look at them closely. But they're like bikinis that they're wearing, rather than the sort of pantaloons and tunics that we think of as being swimming costumes. And again, it's all about freedom of movement. And we see in the top picture a lady swimming, and she was called Mrs. Hilda Willing, and she was the first woman to swim from Rochester to Sheerness, and she swam that in 1919. And when the women were swimming in the Olympics, the distance they swam was 200 meters, because it was felt that women couldn't swim very far. Whereas we see Hilda Willing is swimming a distance of 16 miles down the River Medway. So all these things are suddenly, these views of what women could and couldn't do are being sort of turned on their head. And on the left-hand side, we've got from the plan of the dockyard, you'll see that in the middle it says swimming baths. And from the school logbooks, we know that the girls from Bluetown Primary School were having swimming lessons during the school week. So again, that's a change in attitudes, that girls were learning to swim and participating in swimming events. There were swimming galas regularly, and that they therefore had a different, upbringing to, say, only 20, 30 years before, when swimming wasn't necessarily seen as a ladylike activity. And this is a picture of the Victory Aquatic Swimming Pool. And we talked about the Victory Day being July 1919. And the swimming gala took place on the seafront. And as you can see, everyone's crowded onto the seafront in front of the Catholic Church. I don't know how much you'd be able to see. And of course, you're fighting with the tides and all of that. So it must have been quite epic to be swimming in a swimming gala on the seafront. And this is a little bit about women's football. Now, then, with the rise of the Lionesses and women's football, people have sort of realised that women were playing football during World War I. It was something that's sort of been forgotten and has been revived. And these are pictures I found on Facebook for girls that played football in Sheerness during World War I. Now, I contacted the families and asked them what their grandmothers or great grandmothers did during the war, who they were employed by. But the people didn't know. And what's interesting about Lydia Wright is that her grandson played football for Sheppey and other semi-professional teams. So when he's got his football playing genes, a bit like the Charlton brothers, he got them from the female side rather than from the male side. Now, the only report I could find was about the women playing against the St John's Ambulance Brigade. And so, as you can see, it says here for the Saturday the 28th, it says football match, women workers of the Naval Storehouse versus the St John's Ambulance Brigade. And they played against the men of the St John's Ambulance Brigade. And they won. And the reason for that, I'm told by other people who played football, is that they would have been playing as a team and they would have had tactics and they would have known each other's strengths and weaknesses. Whereas the St John's Ambulance Brigade was probably just 11 men who thought, well, we can beat this bunch of girls, and set off to play against them. One of the other things that we should note from this is the Naval Storehouse, the women in the Naval Storehouse, which is where Gertrude Gamblin, who we spoke about, who brought the charge for sexual harassment against her colleague, she worked in the storehouse. And one of the things, again, is that girls were wearing, if we go back a slide, of course, they're wearing shorts and showing their legs, which, again, girls wouldn't have done at that time. They'd have been wearing skirts, obviously, down almost to the ground. And here they're showing their legs off, which is perhaps one of the reasons why he might have thought that she was more interested in him than she was. This is a little aside, and one of the reasons I've put this aside is because I think it's quite interesting. One of the things it said in the school logbook was when this Wild West Circus came to town, which was just before the advent of World War I, so it was in the July 1914, that the kids stopped going to school, and it's really expensive. If you look at the prices of admission, you see it's 5 shillings, 4 shillings, 3 shillings, 2 shillings, 1 shillings, and sixpence. So somebody paying 5 shillings for a ticket, if you're only earning, like we were seeing the women earning 18 shillings, that's almost like buying a ticket to go to the O2 to see the Oasis concert. It's a lot of money. And so if you think about people having big families, so even at sixpence, that's a lot of money to be paying out for a family if you've got a big family. But it shows, the fact that the dockyard workers earned quite a lot of money. They were quite well paid compared to other labouring jobs. And we talked earlier about the Society for Befriending Women and Girls that Mrs. Hyde Smith was the chairman of. One of the things that kept popping up in the local paper were these adverts for things like Gautier's famous pills, and they if you ever suffer from female weaknesses and irregularities, and so these were actually pills to regulate your periods, and they were also used like a morning after pill. And the opposite side of taking these pills, and these are quite expensive, because it says that a small packet is 1 shilling and threepence, but an extra strong packet is 4 shillings and sixpence. And again, we've just talked about the fact that, if somebody's only earning 18 shillings, that's almost a quarter of a week's wages, that one packet of tablets. But the Society for Befriending Women and Girls, their business was to find girls who were in trouble, as they used to say, and either put them into a home where they would have the babies and then the babies be adopted, or do things like send them off into the colonies, into Australia and Canada, to marry men out there and make decent women of them, or train them up to be domestic servants. But the flip side of all these adverts for these pennyroyal tablets was that under the 1913 Mental Deficiency Act, unmarried mothers could be categorised as moral imbeciles for having a baby out of wedlock, and they could be committed to an asylum. And in the Maidstone Archive, there is a logbook from the Society of Befriending Women and Girls. And in there, if you look in there, it's got details of when they've decided that a woman who's had maybe 2 or 3 children with several men, they are being assigned to be put into an asylum for being as I say, moral imbeciles. And then this is a little bit about the air raids in Sheerness. Now, across Kent, there were many air raids during World War One, and part of the dockyard's role was that it provided an early warning system. So they would set off the dockyard siren to warn people that there was an air raid going to happen. And they also, if somebody was nearby, they would allow you to shelter in the dockyard shelters. But of course, you had to be quite nearby. And again, in the school records, in the school logbooks, it talks about the air raid drills that the children used to do. And if the air raid drill during World War One was that the children would run home. So if the air raid warning, the siren went, they were supposed to run home. And if they were, say, from one of the farms, and so therefore weren't able to run home in 5 minutes, they were assigned a home that they were to run to. So they would, somebody else in their class would take them home, and they would shelter in their own home. But during, so from May the 5th, 1915, when the first air raid was, to August the 24th, 1919, there were 96 air raids over Sheppey. But not all of those dropped bombs, because obviously, if you're on the coast and a plane's coming in, it's got to fly over you to get somewhere else. But obviously there were casualties and there were deaths from it. This is a lady called Marion Burrell, and she was a telephonist. And on the Imperial War Museum site, there's several of these telephonists across Kent who stayed at their station doing taking telegrams during these air raids, and so they were awarded the MBE for courage and devotion during air raids. And this young lady was in the post office in Sheerness for the duration of the war. Now this again is the war memorial in Sheerness, and as you can see at the bottom, it's got killed in enemy aircraft raids, and it names the citizens that were killed. And it includes 2 women there. It includes Mary Hubbard and Laura Cox. And in that picture, go back, in this crowd, I mean, you can't see it because it's too small, but there's this boy with a patch on his eye, and there's loads of stories in the local papers about boys getting into scrapes and doing things like throwing stones and playing with air guns, and several children lose an eye. So what's interesting about this accident in a Sunday school is one boy took a detonator to school. Now, a detonator is what you'd put on the railway tracks during fog, and it would be put there by men working on the railway tracks. So if a train comes, it will explode, and it will alert the train crew that men are working on the tracks. But it would also alert the men working on the tracks that a train is coming. But obviously one of these detonators was missed, and a boy took it into Sunday school and set it off during Sunday school. And it says in this article that his hand was severely damaged. Well, I would believe that if your hand was severely damaged by a detonator, there wouldn't be much hand left. And of course, he goes off to St Bart's Hospital, but fortunately he was able to go in somebody's car, and there were lots of other children injured as well. Now this is one of my last slides. It's pornography and prostitution, which is another dockyard occupation, shall we say. So under the regulations of the Defence of the Realm Act, which came in, which is the thing that brought in passports for Sheppey. I didn't put that picture up, but there was quite a lot of restrictions on what women could do in dockyard towns, because there was an awful lot of sexually transmitted diseases, and there were more men in hospital at some points from having STDs than there were from injuries from the enemy. And so there were several things brought in. There was a a fine brought in, so a system of fines to men in hospital. So they would be fined if they'd got an STD. And in order to mitigate the fine, they would put the blame squarely on any young lady that they'd been with. So there was a system introduced where prostitutes were checked and given certificates for whether or not they were clean or not. But the other thing that I've mentioned here is a story about a lady called Maria Hall, and she ran a newsagent's in the high street just outside where the dock gates are. And she was seen to be selling obscene postcards. And these obscene postcards could be seen by members of the public from the high street. They were in the window, obviously there for the sailors to come and buy. But the police came, seized her supply of postcards and destroyed them. And she was sentenced to a fine of £25 or 3 months in jail for selling pornographic postcards. £25. Now, then we know that people are earning less than 20 shillings a week. So we're talking something like 6 months' wages just for selling some postcards, which is quite draconian, if you ask me. This is my last slide, and it's not really about women in the dockyard, but I think it was quite an interesting view of the war. And what happened was that during the Battle of Heligoland, 2 German sailors were rescued, and the code of the sea was that you would rescue any men in the sea if their ship had gone down. So they were rescued by a British ship, and they were being brought to Chatham to become prisoners of war. However, they were so badly injured that they died on the ships before they actually landed. So they were brought ashore at Sheerness, and they were given full military funerals, with gun carriages and blue jackets, as they call them, to accompany them. And they were buried in the local graveyard. And the town turned out and stood there with respectfully as the gun carriages went by. And of course, this was September 1914. And obviously, not long after, the war sort of escalated, and all this sort of gentlemanly behaviour was given up because there were just too many people dying. But that's the end of my talk. So if anyone got any questions, Craig will take over from now.
Hi, Janys. Thank you so much. That was such a fascinating, wonderful topic, and you really made it so engaging. I really appreciate it. What a fascinating story. There's an incredible little section of life in Sheerness there. Just just quickly to everybody, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat, and I will read them out for you. Or if you would rather ask them, you can use the hand up icon, and you are welcome to ask yourself. But I just wanted to ask, it's in relation to your own stories that you write. Are you using real characters that you've come across, or do you kind of use the essence of characters that you find and elaborate them a little?
I think it's a hybrid there. So I find these little tidbits of stories, and then because obviously the newspapers only give you 2 or 3 paragraphs quite often, and then I just embroider it, go on a flight of fancy. And sometimes I use names that are similar. So in my books, I have a character called Miss Garrett, and she's the deputy headmistress. And there was a story in the papers about 4 teachers who go off to Switzerland during the school holidays. And if you've read the books, Prime Miss Jean Brodie, in that Miss Jean Brodie goes to Italy for her school holidays, for the whole of holidays. And these ladies in 1914 were travelling across Europe by train and going off for holidays, and war was declared, and they were stuck out in Switzerland. And when they were told come home, they said, "Oh, we're having a lovely holiday. Why should we come home? It's nothing to do with us." And so that was like the start of one of the stories. But you know, quite often, like the boy with the exploding detonator, that's
Sure, yeah.
woven in the story. So all those sorts of things, sort of, are the sort of back stitches that I do, and then I build up from there.
Yeah, you can add in those real moments and
Yeah.
give it element of reality as well. Yeah, fantastic. So we're getting a lot of comments saying how fascinating it was, how they really enjoyed the talk, and how interesting they found it. They loved the social history themes, and someone has mentioned that it was particularly handy to know the different wages of the time. I have had a question through. It's Are there any good museums, exhibitions, or online resources where we can find out more about these stories? Have they been contributed to anything like Kent Maps Online, a lot of which essays of prominent persons or events?
But we, at the end of the project that we did, under the Gateways project that was run by Kent and Canterbury University, we put all the research that we did onto the archive that was set up by Queen's University. So our research is in there. We also did produce a little booklet which is available for sale at the Rose Street Cottage in Sheerness. And it's £4. I don't know if we've got many left though, because obviously that was back in 2018. Although that said, we've had COVID since then and nothing moved for 3 years, did it? But so we did produce a little bit. And I say mine always have some of these stories in them as well.
Have you engaged with any of the relatives of people that you've researched? Have you come across any of them?
But as I say, I've contacted people via Facebook. So if they've contacted, what we did do again in the little booklet is in the back of it. I'll see if, hold on a minute. I'll see if I've got a copy.
Sure.
I can't reach. I'm too small. I can't reach it without making too much trouble. But in the back of it, all the names that we had, because like I say in the slides, if I know somebody's name, I've put the name. So in the back of the booklet, there is all the names of all the people that we came across and what jobs they were doing. I do have a spreadsheet as well of that. So if somebody was doing family history, then I can always, if you give me their contact details, or I can send you the spreadsheet and send that on to you.
Amazing. Well, I don't see any more questions, just more thanks and mentions of how great the talk was. So thank you again so much, Janys. Really appreciate you giving us the talk. It was a fascinating topic, and I'm gonna have to get down to Sheerness and start looking at these dockyards and checking it all out, I think. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for attending tonight. And I hope you all enjoyed the amazing talk. We have lots more coming up, so please keep an eye out for our upcoming talks. On Thursday, the 17th of April, we've got Dr. Martin Watts delivering his talk, Richborough, the Secret Port. In June, we'll hear from Giselle Curley and Dr. Emily Stametti Campbell about their work on the positive archaeological activities of the Enabled Archaeology Foundation and Operation Nightingale, and maybe even a little bit of Time Team in there. So, and in July, Isabel Diggle, the Finds Liaison Officer for Kent, will be discussing Step in the Right Direction, further discoveries of the Limb Lamp. This is a Roman copper alloy foot-shaped oil lamp, the first of its kind in Britain. So that'll be really interesting to talk as well. And there's much more. So if you check out the website, you'll see all of our events and our affiliate events, and there's lots on there that we can do into the coming months. As I mentioned earlier, if you're not a member, please do think about joining us. It works out about £3.30 a month, and you'll get our journal and be able to be involved in several of our upcoming events and excavations, and learn about everything Kent heritage as we try and get it out to you. Check the website for more details on these talks and a wide range of other Kent-based events. And that is it from me. Thank you again, Janys. And I shall bid you all good night. We'll see you next month. Good night, people.